We are deep into fall, which means these jumbo chenille yarns have started popping up everywhere, among other things. And everyone from beginner to advanced crafters can't keep their hands off these scrumptious textures. But for how many beginners this yarn attracts, it's not without its challenges. Uneven tension, worming, shedding, and then, of course, how to join a new ball of yarn. Well, I'm here to help, because the last thing I want is for that beautiful yarn that reeled you into crafting to just wind up a frustrating mess in the corner. So let's tackle it together with this project that I made. A beautiful, basic knit throw blanket. I hesitate to even call it a pattern because it's so simple. And I'll tell you how many stitches to cast on, how many rows to knit, and all that. But what's most important is how I knit with this yarn. And that all starts with the cast on. Chenille yarn loves structure, so a stretchy cast on is out of the question. No backwards loop allowed here. We're going to go with the trusty long tail cast on. So make a slip knot, grab the strands, and separate them with your index finger and thumb to make a heart. Work under the first strand, over the second strand, scoop up the third strand, and pull through the loop on your thumb, drop it off, tighten it up, and repeat. And while we're casting on, I'll fill you in on the next chenille pro tip. Go down a needle size or two. Not only will you get a thicker, more lush fabric, but the tighter stitches will decrease incidences of worming, and I found that I had more even tension with this yarn when I knit with smaller needles. So even though my yarn called for 12mm needles, I tried swatches of different smaller sizes and decided that 9mm was the smallest that I could comfortably go with and knit my whole blanket on 9mm needles. That's tension tip number 1, knit with smaller needles. Tension tip number 2 is to knit backwards. Let me explain. I've come to the point where most of us would typically turn our work around to get the empty needle back into your right hand and start purling the wrong side. But to knit backwards, we don't have to do that. You can keep the right side facing you with all the knit stitches and the empty needle in your left hand. Now, knitting backwards is all about working into the back loop. So I'm going to insert my left needle right here through the back loop of the stitch, and I'm slipping the first stitch of my rows for a clean edge, so we'll just slip that off, back onto the left needle. Now for the fun part. We can insert the left needle into the back loop of the next stitch, and talk about how to wrap this backward stitch with the working yarn. So it turns out whether you're knitting backwards or forwards, you'll wrap the needle counterclockwise. You can pretend the tip of your needle is the center of a clock. This would be clockwise, and this is counterclockwise. So wrap your needle counterclockwise, and I like to push the left needle down with my finger to bring the new stitch through. Pull the right needle out to transfer the new stitch to your left needle. Pretty cool, huh? Let's do it again. Insert your left needle through the back loop of the stitch, wrap counterclockwise to bring up a new stitch, pull the right needle out to let the old stitch drop off. And we are officially knitting backwards. And you can keep going. It's amazing how bizarre this feels at first, but how quickly it becomes second nature. Because it's still knitting after all, so even though it's a little different, there's something familiar about it. And now I love knitting the wrong side of stockinette this way. And I really noticed my tension was more even in the chenille yarn by knitting backwards. That may be because I tend to move my needles around a lot when I purl, and just have the tendency to stretch out the occasional stitch, which is especially noticeable in the unforgiving chenille yarn. So learning to knit backwards has saved me a lot of time, some headaches, and it made this very simple project just that little bit more challenging and fun. Word of caution, if you're an experienced knitter and already very used to knitting the other way, you might not be able to knit backwards as much as you think. I actually kind of pulled something around my collarbone while doing this and had to take a break for a few days. It's a new motion that you're not conditioned to yet, so you might have to work your way up to the marathon knitting sessions that you're used to. And you see here, I simply knit the very last stitch. So, To maintain our slip stitch selvedge, I'll just slip the first stitch knitwise. And now I can knit back the other way, how I normally would. Working a whole chunky stockinette blanket without ever having to turn my work or having to purl. Now, let's tackle that other tricky thing about chenille yarn, how to join a new ball. With more typical yarn, we've got these plies to play with that can help us weave in ends and secure them. Or we've got fabrics like wool that are just a bit grippier and can hold yarn ends in place once woven in. With chenille, we don't really have that. We just have this slippery fluff. So let me show you how I do it. I start by just tying a simple knot with about 2 to 3 inches of tail on either strand. And pull as tight as you can, being very careful not to break the yarn, because you could easily do that here. So what do we do with the tails? Well, you may have noticed that these yarns tend to unravel at the ends. We're going to take advantage of this feature and pull off the fluff on purpose, stripping the yarn down to the core string, and go ahead and pull it all off until you reach your knot. Do the same on the other side. Now we've just got 2 sets of strings coming off of our center knot. And what we can do is separate these plies, take one of each string and tie it in a very tight knot. And you can do this as many times as you'd like because the teeny tiny little string knots are getting completely hidden in the fluffy chenille knot. And now you can cut the remaining strings super short. Would you look at that join? I know some people are opposed to knots in their work, but hard to argue with results like these. And that little knot will knit up just fine. You probably barely noticed me knit it right there. Go ahead, spot the knot. And if you've already tied some ends together in another project, you can clean those up using this method too. I do a similar thing for securing the very first and last strands, which I'll show you right here. Finally, I'd like to share my last tip for working with chenille yarn, and it's how I bound off the end of my blanket. The lack of stretch factor can come into play here by having a bind off that's either too loose or too tight. My solution is to stick to a structured bind off, as opposed to a stretchy one, by doing a basic bind off. But to keep my bind off from being too tight and pinching in at the end, I went up 2 needle sizes for the right hand needle that I would use to bind off. Did it make a huge difference? I'm not sure. But even if it was just the placebo effect, helping me remember not to bind off too tightly, it gave a beautiful result. So, there you have it. Some tips and tricks and a little diet knitting pattern to help you tackle that chunky chenille blanket this winter. I have a corresponding blog post to go along with this video, so feel free to reference that during your project as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!